As a physiotherapist, I'm in the industry of protecting athletes and at other times correcting them. And this particular slide reminds me to remember that I am connected to my athletes and that the things that I do can change their lives, and that there are times when we need to protect an athlete from the problems that they carry into their sport. We need to strap their ankles to make sure that unstable ankle doesn't cause them to invert their ankle and suffer an injury that week. We need to strap that shoulder or do some preparatory soft tissue work so that athlete is improved and protected from some of the restrictions that they've got, or the joint weaknesses that they've got as they have to play this very important game this week. And in those times, our experience and our compassion, our skills and our reasoning can literally change lives. This next picture stems from the 2011 season that I worked with the Northern Territory Thunder in the Northeast Australian Football League. And the moral of this picture is that football changes lives, and we see the images and the jubilation after successfully winning a premiership. And I had some feedback from athletes about the things that I was able to do for them that year that allowed them to stay on the field and retain a spot in the side and obviously achieve a premiership success. I also had some feedback from the spouse of the head coach, who's since moved on to bigger and better things, and she was grateful for the work that I had done that had allowed him to have a list of players that were able to play, and she's in a better place now as a result of that success. So there is no doubt at all that football changes lives in that respect, and that's because of the protection that you may do in season. This next slide is interesting. I'll just let you soak it in here. Let's eat, Grandpa. Let's eat, Grandpa. And the difference there is that if you change the punctuation, if you correct the punctuation, you can literally save a person's life. We don't want to eat Grandpa, we want to eat with Grandpa. And it illustrates that there are times in our professional life when protection just won't do, and that we have to correct a problem. And our skills and our compassion, experience, and reasoning will allow us to see something so we can do something to change risk factors that our patients have. And that can change lives just as much as the protection. So we see this slide here of this particular individual who, as well as protecting him in season, we had to correct him in the off season, and he was about to retire. And I said to his high performance manager, let me have a look at him, let's do some screening, let's find some risk factors, and if he still wishes to retire because he's just had enough of the game, then so be it. But if he suddenly realises that he moves much better than he thought was possible and he'd like to have another go at it, then he could. And you can see on the right hand side that he is celebrating the success of a premiership victory 11 or 12 months later. And so the correction that we did also changed his lives. And it stems back to the words I was saying before, that the skills and compassion, experience and reasoning that we have allows us to see something so we can do something to change it. And that brings us to this scenario, this high performance team of exercise physiologists and strength and conditioning coach and sports scientists and physiotherapists. We saw something 11 months earlier and we did something about it, and that was the reward, and there's no doubt it changes lives. These two individuals on the left are young boys from Elcho Island in the remote Northern Territory of Australia, and they went to boarding school in Darwin, and they often would visit a friend of mine, and she would bring them to the football, and they tugged on my shirt and said, Greg, can we get a photo with Andrew McLeod? And obviously I agreed and said, let's get into the rooms, and we got into the change rooms, and I put them up on my shoulders, and we sang the song as a group, and the team song, and they got a photo and took this photo back to their local community, and obviously their family would be very proud of that moment, and it just reminds me not to assume that what we're doing is insignificant. that you can definitely change lives by working in the field of sport. And so when we look at returning to sport, we use a different return to sport criteria at the Northern Territory Institute of Sport than perhaps a private practitioner who services an athlete in season from week to week. And we use a long-term athletic development pathway with levels of competency and a vocabulary that's quite different. And we have seasonal goals, but we have 3 and 4 year goals. And so our return to sport criteria is based on a priority that the athlete sets with their coach and with their parent and to some extent the medical service staff. And so for me to best advise head coaches of the current standing of that athlete, I have to be accountable to modifying risk factors for the sake of the long-term athletic development. And some of those risk factors require us to go further back along the chain of neurodevelopmental sequence, the type of movements that we should have been able to do as toddlers and kids and infants. And so we do movement screening, obviously, but the context of movement screening is highlighted by the next couple of slides. We look at a blood pressure cuff and we understand that if you fail a blood pressure test and you want to be well, then you better make a lifestyle correction to bring that blood pressure down below a safe level. And so when an athlete comes on scholarship, they get a medical screen to ensure they don't need major lifestyle changes or other major medical interventions for health reasons. And we know that if they fail a visual test and they want to see the ball well, then they better get a visual correction. We also know that if they fail a movement screen, that they better make a movement correction. And that separating movement problems from speed and strength and endurance and power allows us to work out whether it's a pure performance issue or whether the performance issue is subordinate to poor movement. It's really hard to balance and perform when you've got dysfunctional movement. So a movement screen may show us that they move clearly and they don't perform well, and that's a performance issue. But if they don't perform well and they haven't checked movement, then adding more performance training on top may not actually change their performance. So we look at the optimal performing athlete, footballer in the case of a couple of years ago when I was working with Northern Territory Thunder. This particular pyramid is based on competency. At the very bottom, we need to make sure that the athlete is medically healthy, that the systems of their body are competent to allow them to function. Then on top of that, we look at their functional competence, the ability to move well. Then we look at their ability to move often, which is their performance capacity. And then we look at their ability to apply that body to use the skills and strategy of a thinking athlete. And we ask certain questions. Head coach is going to ask, how skillful and smart a footballer are you? How well do you use the skills and strategies? And an example might be, how well do you kick? How well do you tackle? How well do you use your hands? Etc. And he's going to identify an athlete who's got a good set of skills and strategy. But a strength and conditioning coach is going to ask, how fit are you for football? How strong are you? How fast are you? How long can you keep going for? And we're going to do a bunch of tests to check those things. And the physical training staff, the physical therapy staff are going to ask questions like, how well do you move as a platform for performance? And what does this tell us about your risk of injury? And that's our movement competency screenings. And then the medical staff may ask some questions related to vision and cardiovascular fitness. But if this is all you had, you only knew how fit somebody was and how well they used their skills in the sport, and you just monitored that through the year, then would you feel responsible putting a fitness program together if you didn't know whether someone's fundamental movement pattern or medical systems were putting them at risk of failure? So I'd suggest that if you didn't have those areas there, then you would be putting someone at risk. So we look at the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the performance pyramid. On the left-hand side, you want to screen, test, and assess. On the right-hand side, you want to correct. Screening is where you check for risk. Testing is where you check for ability. Assessing is where you check for disability. And different individuals have different roles to play. So we can test ability when it comes to skills and strategy. How often can somebody hit a ball? How often can they get a free throw into the basket? We can also correct that with skills training and instruction. We can test ability regarding the physical capacity. How fast can they run? How high can they jump? And we can train that using targeted strength and conditioning training. And we can screen movement patterns for competency, which indicates a risk level. We can also improve and correct movement patterns with targeted interventions. We can also screen medical systems, and we can ask questions about their past history and their local circumstances, which can help us give some information about their risk level. So if we're looking at the different variations of the performance pyramid, this particular one is called the overpowered pyramid, where the performance capacity in the middle of the triangle there is actually wider than the base of movement that they have. And in this situation, an athlete is at increased risk of injury and attrition from the sport. So the strategy required is that you need to reset that base level, reset the fundamental movement patterns. And if you look at the bottom left, we do that by using manual therapy and corrective strategies. And when you go ahead and apply those techniques, then you move somebody from a really narrow platform to a wider platform. And that changes their risk profile. And we hope to keep doing this until eventually you get to a normal risk of injury. That doesn't always happen with some individuals because you may have some permanent changes that aren't able to be completely removed. But you're likely to see that any type of input will move them to a better risk category to some extent. In the underpowered pyramid, the middle section is much narrower than the others, and in those circumstances, we're talking about a performance capacity which is reduced. They have a reduced ability to push or pull, therefore they're weaker. They have a reduced ability to cover a certain distance in a period of time, therefore they're slower. These athletes just need to get fitter. They need some targeted strength and conditioning training because they already have an underpinning base of movement which is quite good. And they still know how to apply the skills to the game. They're just not very fit. So there are some circumstances where we need to understand where individuals within a team environment fit. And the medical staff, it's obvious that they fit in terms of the body systems. And the physiotherapy staff, the strength and conditioning staff on the left-hand side can do testing and screening for functional competence. And on the right-hand side, it's usually the physiotherapist or the osteopath or the chiropractor who understands this model, who can do the corrections to improve movement competency. And our strength and conditioning staff do the testing and the corrections for performance capacity. And there's some overlap between the physiotherapy staff there as well. And at the top, the head coach really just wants to be involved in testing and correcting the skills of the sport. That's what they got into the sport for. So Benjamin Franklin said, "Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I learn." And if we look at the three important R's in the corrections and protections world of physiotherapy, we know that the reset is where the passive magic occurs, where you manipulate or you dry needle or you do active release therapy, or you use vacuum cupping, or you use some form of manual therapy to change somebody's movement patterns without them actually being involved. And then you go ahead and reinforce that movement pattern that's been restored by actively getting them to do exercise. And of course, if you add load at the end of it, or you reload them, that's like hitting the save button. And the reason we bring those two slides up is because they're kind of hand in hand. Tell me and I'll forget. That's the reset. That's you doing a passive intervention where the person's not involved. Movement pattern competency is not likely to stick if you just do resetting techniques over and over again. Show me and I may remember. So you get somebody else to do, you get an athlete to do a reset technique like foam rolling or self-myofascial release. Then they may get involved in their own resetting and they may understand these things a bit better. That's the reinforce. If you add some corrective exercise on top, they still may stick around. If you involve me by reloading them, you get them involved in a better movement pattern with some load, there's a pretty good chance that body is going to listen better than the athlete will. And so they do go hand in hand, and there's some relevance there. So we look at a situation where we want to find out the functional capacity of an individual. We go ahead and do a screening. When we do a screening, we use validated and reliable screening tools that are both quick and portable. And the screening test of choice in my world and the world of the colleagues that I get involved in is the functional movement screen and the lower quarter Y balance test. And when we use these screening tools, we run them through a software program which is also valid. The software program generates a report. It generates a report that places the athlete into one of four categories: substantial deficit or significant risk, moderate deficit or moderate risk, slight or normal deficit or slight or normal risk. And they're red, orange, yellow or green. So there's really small text here, but you've got four categories and you can see those. And that's second from the top, which is a moderate deficit. So you've generated an individual risk report. You can also generate a report that places that athlete's risk within the context of the whole group. And you can find out how many within a group fit into that orange category. When that occurs, the physiotherapist takes hold of that report. He says, okay, you've got some problems here. We need to do some reset techniques. But we need to find out why that pattern's not working. So then we use all the tricks and the assessment techniques and all the weekend courses that we've learned and the undergraduate degrees that we've done and the master's degrees that we've done to come up with an understanding of their impairments. And then we evaluate it and we treat it. When we treated it, hopefully we move them to a better movement platform. We're going to lock it in though, so we need to do some reinforcing exercise. We need to reinforce what we have reset. So when we've done the functional movement screen, we're checking somebody's capacity to move with their own body weight. When we do the lower quarter Y balance test, we're shifting that body weight to one leg, and therefore that's at twice the body weight. We may go ahead then and do some assessments at 4 times the body weight on 2 legs, looking at landing techniques, because we know landing techniques are a risk factor for injury. We then do some 4 times body weight on single leg. There's some hop testing. We also know that they're predictive through asymmetry or through reduced capacity. We hand them over to the strength and conditioning staff after having already reset, look down the bottom, and reinforced, look to the right. Strength and conditioning coach can now go ahead and reliably assess performance, understanding that if they perform poorly, it's not because they don't move well. It's because they're not strong enough, fast enough, powerful enough, or agile enough, or have enough endurance. And they'll use tests that are going to tell them or give them a baseline number, and then they can reload them using targeted strength and conditioning training with the confidence that the reason for not being able to perform is not related to poor movement capacity or ill health. Then we can deliver that athlete to the coach who can work on those skills and those strategies to produce an optimal performing footballer. Throughout the season, we can monitor and intervene. We can check on these things relatively quickly throughout the season. And we can use pictorials such as this. An athlete presents after the weekend's game. They get a graph, they get a chart that shows a lot of greens and reds and yellows. The more important thing is that they go to those individual service providers, the head coach, the strength and conditioning coach, the physical therapist, and say, I've got some reds here, can you help me get rid of these reds? Because the more greens that I've got, the better I feel, the better I move, more likely I am to get up game. He says, I'm glad you asked. Let's work on your set plays. Let's work on your deadlift, which is down a little bit this week. Let's work on your shoulder mobility, which is a little bit down since you took that knock. Because if you move well and then you move often, pretty good chance that you're going to be in a good place to be able to perform as an athlete. So, using that paradigm, I recognise that I've got effectively one job to do, and that is to assess, screen, movement competency, and deliver an athlete to a strength and conditioning staff moving well and moving often, with risk factors that they carried modified as much as possible. So I asked myself, have I removed all modifiable risk factors for injury? And do I know who's more likely to be injured prior to the commencement of training? And if I haven't answered those questions, I'm not finished with that athlete. So we use a return to sport or return to activity criteria. And Phil Plisky was excellent enough to produce this checklist for one of his particular cohorts of athletes, whether it be anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction, rehabilitation. So he uses a profile that's in a hierarchy. First of all, that it shouldn't have pain. They shouldn't have pain during their rehab. They should have normal range of movement and normal strength within 5% of each side. Their functional movement screen shouldn't have any zeros of pain or ones of dysfunctional movement. Their lower quarter Y balance test should be symmetrical to within 4 centimeters and 6 centimeters in different directions. And that their composite score should be above a particular threshold for their peers. That they should have normal landing techniques and 3 to 5% limb symmetry index in hop testing. And that the Move to Perform software should place them in the bottom 2 categories of risk. And then they go through a return to sport progression without pain or without performance deficits due to compensations. At times they may need a biomechanical assessment if they've had multiple injuries time and time again. And it's a lovely hierarchy that says check, 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 check. Yes, I have checked modifiable risk factors and I can confidently deliver that athlete back to their medical staff. So we often ask the question or state to ourselves at certain stages through the year, to prevent future injury, disability and staleness in my athletes, I will ... And we like to give ourselves a task. For example, I will present this return to sport discharge criteria to every athlete on the first 1 or 2 days. I will ensure that I've modified as many risk factors as possible before I deliver them to return to sport. Or I will inform them that there are several modifiable risk factors that have not yet been modified and that they make a return to sport decision in an informed way. And so the bigger model might look like this in an ideal world. And Phil Plisky came up with this again. If you wanted to systematically prevent injuries for sports or for military occupations or for general fitness, then before somebody starts their activity on step 1, they would do some baseline testing and run it through a Move to Perform software and come up with a risk level. The athlete's well informed now, whether they're a tactical athlete or industrial athlete or recreational athlete or professional athlete. Once you've done that, you can put a plan together that prevents injury based on their risk. And you'll do some corrective exercises or some reset techniques, etc. If an injury occurs, then you need to go through a particular movement assessment that separates painful patterns from dysfunctional patterns. And you're attempting to normalize those and then redo some baseline testing to see if somebody has improved their risk profile. And if you've done some of those things and normalized them, then you need to make sure that you can prove that when the body weight is multiplied through hopping and stopping and jumping and drop jumps and tuck jumps. And again, running it through the software to make sure that you are demonstrating a systematic reduction in modifiable risk factors. Lather, rinse, repeat. And so if you wanted to know more information about that, you can either check me out on Twitter. I'd encourage you also to check out Phil Plisky on Twitter, because he'll come up with a whole bunch of injury prevention stuff that is above and beyond what I've talked about, and he's an excellent resource. And if anything's come out of today, I hope you understand that the sport that you're involved in does change lives, and that we need to assume that that person that we're intervening with on that particular day is going to be affected by what we do, and therefore we need to be accountable. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion. As I said, check me out on Twitter. Contact me if you need to. And have a great day.